The morning mist hung thick over the flat Dutch countryside near Eindhoven in September 1940, as Hauptmann Klaus Becker stood at the edge of what would become one of the most elaborate deceptions of World War II. At 38 years old, Becker was a Luftwaffe engineering officer who had spent 20 years building airfields across Germany. Now, in occupied Holland, he had been given an unusual assignment: build an airfield that looked completely real but was made entirely of wood. "Herr Hauptmann, the carpenters from Amsterdam have arrived," reported Feldwebel Otto Schmidt, Becker's construction supervisor. Schmidt was 52, a master carpenter in civilian life who had been conscripted despite his age because of his specialized skills. "They want to know where to begin." Becker unrolled the plans across the hood of his staff car, weighing down the corners with rocks against the autumn breeze. The drawings showed a complete Luftwaffe fighter base: 3 hangars, fuel storage tanks, anti-aircraft gun emplacements, barracks, vehicles, and, most importantly, a dozen Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters positioned around the field as if ready for immediate scramble. "We begin with the hangars," Becker decided. "They're the largest structures and will be visible from the greatest distance. The British reconnaissance flights photograph this area daily. We need to give them something to see." The strategic logic behind the deception was simple. Real Luftwaffe airfields were scattered across occupied Holland, supporting fighter and bomber operations against Britain. The RAF was conducting increasingly effective bombing raids against these bases, destroying aircraft on the ground and cratering runways. If the Germans could build a convincing fake airfield, British bombers might waste precious ordnance attacking wooden structures instead of real facilities, but the execution would be extraordinarily complex. From 20,000 feet, the altitude at which RAF reconnaissance aircraft operated, the fake airfield had to appear identical to a real one. That meant not just building structures that looked right, but creating an entire operational facility with all the details that made an airfield recognizable: vehicles moving between buildings, aircraft positioned logically for dispersal, support equipment near the planes, anti-aircraft positions protecting key assets. The work began in early October 1940. Hundreds of Dutch labourers were conscripted to clear the site, a flat field that the Germans had identified as visually similar to the real Eindhoven airfield, 10 kilometres away. Trees were cut, drainage ditches dug, the ground roughly levelled. From above, it would appear that construction of a new airfield had begun. Then the carpenters arrived, along with truckloads of timber, canvas, and paint. Under Schmidt's direction, they began constructing the first hangar, a massive structure 40 metres long and 30 metres wide, designed to house fighter aircraft. But instead of steel framework and concrete walls, this hangar was built from timber posts and beams, with canvas stretched over the frame and painted to resemble corrugated metal. "The shadows are wrong," observed Lieutenant Hans Weber, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer assigned to oversee the deception's effectiveness. Weber was 29, a former architecture student who understood how structures appeared from various angles and under different lighting conditions. From directly overhead at noon, a real metal hangar casts a darker shadow than canvas. We need to paint false shadows on the ground beside the structure. This attention to detail became the hallmark of the project. Nothing was simple or straightforward. The wooden aircraft had to be positioned at angles that matched how real fighters would be dispersed for protection against air attack. The fake fuel tanks needed to show the same weathering patterns as real tanks. Even the tyre tracks leading to and from structures had to be maintained, with workers dragging logs across the ground daily to create fresh tracks that suggested ongoing activity. Flight Officer James Mitchell of the RAF's Photographic Reconnaissance Unit flew his Spitfire over Holland on November 15, 1940, at 25,000 feet, his cameras clicking automatically at precise intervals. At 32, Mitchell was one of the most experienced reconnaissance pilots in the RAF, having flown dozens of missions photographing German positions across occupied Europe. He had learned to recognize airfields, factories, military installations, anything that might be a worthy target for bomber command. Through breaks in the cloud cover, his cameras captured images of a new airfield under construction near Eindhoven. 3 large hangars were visible, along with what appeared to be aircraft dispersal areas and support buildings. Mitchell noted the location on his map and continued his mission, unaware that every detail below him was a carefully crafted fiction. Back at RAF Medmenham in Buckinghamshire, photographic interpreters examined Mitchell's film under powerful magnification. Section Officer Sarah Hughes was 24, a former geography teacher who had been recruited for her ability to analyze aerial photographs and identify military significance. She studied the images of the new Dutch airfield with practiced attention. New construction near Eindhoven, Hughes reported to her supervisor, squadron leader Peter Ashworth. 3 hangars approximately 75% complete, no aircraft visible yet, but dispersal areas being prepared. Appears to be a fighter base. Add it to the target list, Ashworth replied. Bomber Command will want to hit it before it becomes operational. This was exactly what the Germans hoped would happen. But there was a problem that Klaus Becker was only beginning to understand. The project was taking far too long. In the muddy field that would become the fake airfield, work proceeded slowly through the wet Dutch autumn. The carpenters were skilled, but building convincing wooden replicas of complex military equipment was time-consuming. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter was an intricate machine with a distinctive profile: the inverted gull wings, the enclosed canopy, the prominent air intake beneath the nose. Replicating that in wood required precise measurements and careful construction. "We need 12 aircraft," Becker told Schmidt in early December, surveying their progress. "We have completed 4, and they don't look quite right. The wing angles are wrong on 2 of them." "Herr Hauptmann, the men are working as fast as they can," Schmidt replied defensively. "Building a convincing aircraft from wood is not simple carpentry. We need patterns, precise measurements, and the weather is terrible. The wood warps when it gets wet." Becker understood the difficulties, but he also understood that time was running out. Each week that passed allowed the RAF to photograph the site's gradual development. If British photo interpreters were competent, and Becker assumed they would be tracking the construction's progress. They would notice if the airfield took 6 months to build, when a real airfield could be completed in 6 weeks. By January 1941, the fake airfield was nearing completion, but it had taken 4 months instead of the planned 6 weeks. 3 wooden hangars stood at the field's edge, painted to resemble metal structures. 12 wooden Bf 109s were positioned around the dispersal areas, mounted on rails that allowed them to be moved occasionally to simulate aircraft repositioning. Wooden fuel trucks, ammunition trailers, and even wooden anti-aircraft guns surrounded the facility. The final touch was adding occupied-looking details. Canvas tents were erected to suggest barracks. Smoke generators were installed to simulate cooking fires and heating stoves. Paths were worn between buildings to create the appearance of regular foot traffic. "It's ready," Becker declared in late January 1941. "Alert Luftwaffe intelligence that the decoy is operational. Let's see if the RAF takes the bait." But at RAF Medmenham, Sarah Hughes had been tracking the Dutch airfield's construction for 3 months, and something bothered her. She pulled out the entire sequence of reconnaissance photographs, laying them side by side on her light table, studying the progression from bare field to completed facility. "Peter, can you look at these?" she called to squadron leader Ashworth. Ashworth joined her at the light table, examining the image sequence. "What am I looking at?" This airfield near Eindhoven. Watch how it develops over time." She pointed to successive images. "Here in October, they're just clearing ground. November, they're framing the first hangar. December, second and third hangars going up. January, aircraft appear. But notice anything strange? Should I? The construction sequence is wrong. Real airfield construction happens much faster. You lay concrete, erect prefabricated hangars. Aircraft arrive almost immediately. This has taken 4 months, and I'm not seeing the usual construction equipment. No concrete mixers, no steel fabrication gear. And look at these aircraft." She pointed to the latest photos showing the wooden Bf-109s. "They're positioned identically in every photograph from the past 3 weeks. Real aircraft move constantly, taxi to different positions, some leave on missions, others return. These haven't moved." Ashworth studied the images carefully under magnification. Hughes was right. The aircraft were too static, the construction too slow, the activity patterns wrong. "I think it's a decoy," Hughes concluded. "Probably wood or other lightweight materials, built to draw bombing raids away from real airfields. Can you prove it?" "Not definitively without a ground inspection, but the evidence is suggestive. We should recommend Bomber Command not waste resources on this target." But her report faced skepticism. Other photo interpreters disagreed with her assessment. The airfield looked real enough to them, and targets in occupied Europe were always treated as genuine unless proven otherwise. The debate continued through February 1941, with Hughes arguing for caution and others pushing for an attack. The decision was finally made at a higher level than photo interpretation. Wing Commander Robert Braham, commanding No. 2 Group Bomber Command, reviewed the intelligence and decided the risk was acceptable. "Even if it's a decoy," Braham told his staff, "destroying it sends a message to the Germans that we can hit targets in occupied Holland at will. And if Hughes is wrong, if it's real, we prevent the airfield from becoming operational. Schedule the raid." But before Bomber Command could organize an attack, an American journalist would change everything. William Shirer was 46 years old, a CBS correspondent based in Berlin who had been covering Nazi Germany since before the war began. On November 27, 1940, while the fake Dutch airfield was still under construction, Shearer recorded an entry in his diary that would eventually become famous. "X says the British intelligence in Holland is working fine. Both sides in this war have built a number of dummy airdromes and strewn them with wooden planes. X says the Germans recently completed a very large one near Amsterdam. They lined up more than 100 dummy planes made of wood on the field and waited for the British to come over and bomb them. Next morning, the British did come. They let loose with a lot of bombs. The bombs were made of wood." This diary entry, though written months before the fake Eindhoven airfield was completed, would become the foundation of a legend that has persisted for 80 years. The story of RAF pilots dropping wooden bombs on wooden airfields as a deliberate joke, a wood for wood response to German deception. Whether this actually happened at Eindhoven or any other location remains historically uncertain. But the story spread rapidly through both air forces, becoming the kind of tale that pilots love to tell, a moment of humour in a brutal war, a clever response to enemy trickery. At the real Eindhoven airfield, the one 10 kilometres from the fake facility, Oberleutnant Werner Steiner commanded a Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter squadron, tasked with defending Holland against RAF incursions. Steiner was 31, a veteran with 12 victories who understood the strategic situation his squadron faced. "The British bomb us almost nightly," Steiner told his pilots in February 1941. "Last week they cratered our main runway. Last month they destroyed 2 of our aircraft on the ground. We need every advantage we can get, And the decoy airfield is designed to give us that. When British bombers attack the fake field instead of this one, they waste bombs, fuel and flight time. They might lose aircraft to our flak defences around the decoy. Every raid they conduct against a wooden target is a raid that doesn't damage our actual capabilities. But in late February 1941, something unexpected happened. A lone RAF bomber, the accounts vary as to whether it was a Bristol Blenheim, a Wellington or a smaller aircraft, appeared over the fake airfield at low altitude in early morning. Klaus Becker was inspecting the facility when he heard the aircraft approaching. "Take cover," he shouted to the workers maintaining the site. "British bomber incoming." The aircraft circled once at low altitude, low enough that Becker could see the RAF roundels on its wings, then made a straight approach toward the centre of the fake airfield. Becker braced for the explosion of real bombs that would tear apart months of careful construction. Instead, something heavy tumbled from the aircraft and impacted in the middle of the field with a surprisingly soft thud. The aircraft climbed away without dropping additional ordnance, disappearing into the low clouds. Becker and Schmidt cautiously approached the impact point, expecting to find an unexploded bomb. What they found instead would become legendary: a large wooden cylinder, roughly bomb-shaped, painted with RAF colours and bearing a message chalked on its side. According to various versions of the story, the message read "Wood for Wood," or "Compliments of the RF," or simply "From England with Love." The exact wording has been lost to time and embellishment, but the message was clear. The RAF knew the airfield was fake, and they were responding with appropriate humour. When Becker's report reached Luftwaffe intelligence headquarters in Berlin, reactions varied from embarrassment to grudging admiration. The deception had failed in its primary purpose, drawing real bombing raids away from real targets. But it had succeeded in demonstrating German ingenuity and had prompted an unusual response that both sides would remember. The fake Eindhoven airfield remained in place throughout 1941 and into 1942, occasionally photographed by RAF reconnaissance, but never seriously attacked. It became something of a tourist attraction for Luftwaffe personnel stationed in Holland, a curiosity they would show to visiting officers. "Come see our wooden air force," pilots would joke. "The safest squadron in Holland, never lost a man, never lost an aircraft." But the story of wooden airfields and wooden bombs spread far beyond Eindhoven. Similar deception operations were being conducted by both sides across Europe. The Germans built fake facilities to protect real ones. The British built dummy installations around actual factories to confuse German bombers during the Blitz. The Americans would later create entire phantom armies with inflatable tanks and dummy equipment for Operation Fortitude before D-Day. The practice of aerial deception became a science. By 1943, both sides employed specialists who understood how to create convincing fake installations, how to maintain them to appear active, how to protect real facilities through misdirection rather than just armour and anti-aircraft guns. Colonel Erich von Schrader was assigned to Luftwaffe deception operations in 1942, tasked with evaluating the effectiveness of decoy airfields across occupied Europe. At 45, von Schrader was a career officer who approached the assignment with the same analytical rigour he had previously applied to logistics planning. "The Eindhoven decoy was a failure," von Schrader concluded in his report to the High Command. "The British identified it as fake before we could exploit it operationally, but we learned valuable lessons about how to construct more convincing deceptions. The primary errors were: construction took too long, allowing observation of the entire building process. Aircraft were too static, not showing normal operational movement, and we failed to simulate realistic activity patterns around the facility." Von Schrader recommended improvements for future deception operations. faster construction using prefabricated components, mobile elements that could be repositioned regularly, better understanding of what photo interpreters looked for when evaluating targets, and, most importantly, embedding the deception within a larger operational security program that included false radio traffic and deceptive communications. Some of these recommendations were implemented. Later, German decoy installations were more sophisticated, built more quickly, maintained more convincingly. But by 1943, Allied photo interpretation had also evolved, with analysts like Sarah Hughes developing systematic methods for identifying fake facilities. The cat-and-mouse game of deception and detection continued throughout the war, with each side trying to outsmart the other. The Germans built fake installations while carefully camouflaging real ones. The Allies tried to photograph everything, analyze everything, determine what was real and what was illusion. After the war ended in May 1945, the fake Eindhoven airfield was dismantled, its wooden components scavenged by local Dutch residents desperate for building materials in the impoverished post-war years. The site returned to agriculture, and within a decade, little remained to show where the elaborate deception had stood. Klaus Becker survived the war and returned to Germany, where he resumed his peacetime engineering career. He rarely spoke about the wooden airfield project, considering it an interesting footnote in a career that had included much more significant construction projects. But in the 1960s, when historians began researching W2 deception operations, Becker was interviewed about his experiences. "Was the wooden airfield a success?" the historian asked. "In one sense, no," Becker replied, now in his 70s. "We didn't fool the RAF into wasting significant resources attacking it. But in another sense, yes, we demonstrated German ingenuity and adaptability. We showed that even with limited resources, we could create convincing deceptions. And we gave both sides a story worth telling, the wooden bomb on the wooden airfield. In a war of terrible things, sometimes a moment of absurdity has its own value." Sarah Hughes, the photo interpreter who had identified the decoy, stayed with RAF intelligence throughout the war, eventually rising to command the entire photo interpretation section at Medmenham. After the war, she was awarded the MBE for her contributions to aerial intelligence. She died in 1998, age 82, having spent her later years teaching geography again and occasionally lecturing about photo interpretation to intelligence students. William Shirer's diary entry about the wooden bomb would be published in his 1941 book Berlin Diary, becoming one of the war's most repeated anecdotes. Historians have debated its accuracy, some claiming it's true, others calling it wartime legend, but the story persists because it captures something essential about how humans respond to war's absurdity with humour and cleverness. The wooden airfield near Eindhoven, and others like it across occupied Europe, represented a peculiar form of warfare, where the objective wasn't destruction but deception, where success was measured not in enemy casualties but in enemy confusion. These installations were weapons that never fired a shot, defences that never stopped a bullet, yet they consumed resources, required maintenance, and occupied the attention of highly trained personnel on both sides. In the broader context of WW2 deception operations, the wooden airfields were relatively minor compared to operations like Fortitude, which created an entire phantom army group to mislead the Germans about D-Day. But they demonstrated principles that would become fundamental to military deception: attention to detail matters. Time is a factor in maintaining credibility, and the human element, how observers think and what they expect to see, is as important as the physical deception. Today, a marker stands near the site of the fake Eindhoven airfield, erected by local historians to commemorate this unusual chapter of WW2 Tales history. The marker includes a replica wooden bomb, acknowledging the famous story even while noting that its exact details remain uncertain. Visitors to the site can still see the flat field where German engineers and Dutch carpenters spent months building an airfield that was never meant to fly aircraft, creating a deception that didn't quite succeed in its intended purpose, but succeeded brilliantly in capturing imagination. The lesson of the wooden airfield transcends the specific tactical situation of 1940-41 Holland. It reminds us that warfare isn't just about firepower and technology, but also about perception and psychology. The Germans invested significant resources building fake installations because they understood that Allied bombers had limited ordnance and couldn't waste it on worthless targets. The RAF responded with humour, a wooden bomb for a wooden airfield, because they understood that acknowledging enemy cleverness while demonstrating you weren't fooled sent its own message. In the end, the fake Eindhoven airfield and the legendary wooden bomb represent a moment when the brutal machinery of war paused for an exchange of wit, when ingenuity was met with humour, when wood for wood became not just a physical response, but a philosophical statement about the absurdity of the entire enterprise. The wooden airfield that never launched a real aircraft, that never defended anything except perhaps the morale of those who built it and those who recognized it for what it was. This strange structure made of timber, canvas, and human ingenuity remains one of WW2's most memorable deceptions, not because it succeeded in fooling anyone, but because it tried, and in trying, revealed something about the creativity and humour that humans maintain, even in war's darkest hours.